It's hard today to think of a time when Star Wars was not all over the toy aisle. No matter what the incarnation, it tends to be a brand that the toy industry considers evergreen, meaning always present. This is Scott Toy Guru Neitlich. I've been a toy maker for about 25 years and I'm also a collector. And one of the brands that I am passionate about collecting is Star Wars. I was there in the 80s buying all of these figures, or at least receiving them as gifts, and as an adult, I'm still buying these from the same company. Star Wars by Kenner, which is now owned by Hasbro, had a huge run between 1977 and 1985. But 1985, some other brands came along in the toy market that really stole the hearts and minds of children. And while Star Wars was great, without another movie after Return of the Jedi was over, well, sales did start to fade. It's kind of surprising to think that there was a time when Star Wars was not a huge brand at retail. From the early bird kit, the first ever produced toy in 1977, all the way through the Power of the Force, the original Power of the Force toys from 1984, 1985, the vintage Star Wars line had a really spectacular run. A big part of that was the amazing team that worked on it, that really understood the brand. One of the leads on that team was Mark Bardot, who worked all the way up until his recent retirement on Star Wars. He worked on pretty much every Millennium Falcon toy Kenner/Hasbro ever put out, which is pretty amazing. His run probably won't be topped as far as continuity as a Star Wars designer. Well, back in 1985, or at least in 1984, 83, a pitch was created for an 85 line that was going to continue Star Wars after Return of the Jedi. Kenner had a gold mine on their hands, and they obviously didn't want to let this go. And while there were other brands encroaching on the boys' action figure market, the idea from Kenner was that even without another movie post Return of the Jedi, they could keep Star Wars going at retail and continue it with their own storylines. So they put together a proposal that included toys, prototype models, new characters, and concepts for how they would keep Star Wars evergreen or at least hot at retail despite no new movies or content. And I'm not counting the Ewok Adventure or Star Tours or some of those other things that came out. There was no theatrical release. And with that, it was time to have a new approach. So, that was not a New Hope joke. Okay, maybe it was. So, Luke Skywalker would have continued to be a big part of the line, but now he would have been a full Jedi Knight. And this was how Kenner envisioned he would look as a Jedi Knight/Jedi Master, teaching the next generation. Han Solo, likewise, would continue, this time as a star leader of the Alliance, or now I guess the New Republic, decked out in kind of more of a military-esque outfit, complete with medals and shoulder pads and the whole 9 yards, and really taking him all the way from a smuggler to now a legitimate hero of the New Republic and a leader. One of my absolute personal favorites was the Mogo Beefhead Tribesman, a new alien created for this line. And if you're looking at this figure and you're especially looking at his head and thinking, wait a minute, I think I've seen that before. Well, yeah, that's because Kenner took the existing figure of Squidhead, or Tessek as he's now known, one of Jabba the Palace's flunky aliens, and basically just took his head and flipped it upside down, which honestly is something that happens in the toy industry a lot more than you would probably think. And it's funny because the Mogo Beefhead figure has actually kind of gotten a life of his own amongst, I guess, the super fans, because this pitch has been out there and it's been on the internet. It's not like I'm showing it for the very first time. And there have been fan creations in even different form factors, ranging from Lego to t-shirts to even making art that would show what the figure would have looked like had it actually been released in the vintage line. And people have even created prototypes, or rather custom figures, of all the way through a packaged example if Mogo Beefhead had actually made it into the line. I always thought this would be a great Comic-Con exclusive from Hasbro. All right, So, continuing along, some favorites would have entered the line in '85, including a finally released Grand Moff Tarkin, who was done last year by Hasbro, and a Bantha for the vintage line was not only drawn up, but was on the product list to be released. And this is actually by Mark Bardot. Pretty cool. The new villain. So now that Vader and the Emperor were gone, they were going to introduce a new secret villain. This was, before all the other new villains like Thrawn and Prince Chizor and, all sorts of, baddies, Moff Gideon. Well before new villains were being created, Kenner had their own new villain, and his name was Agatha Prime. He was going to come from the outer rim of the galaxy and harness the technology of cloning to make war against the New Republic. And if you think you've seen the design for Agatha Prime before, and you're like, wait a minute, I know that design. Well, that's because the design was reused by Dark Horse Comics as part of their Dark Empire comic book series as the Imperial Sentinels. So while originally Agatha Prime was one single character, one single figure, Dark Horse really liked this design and repurposed it and used it as, I don't want to say an army builder because it's not like an army of them, but it's kind of like the Imperial Guards in Return of the Jedi. There's, like maybe 6 of them that guard the Clone Emperor in that series. And ironically, Kenner/Hasbro actually made a figure of this figure from the Expanded Universe line in Power of the Force 2. So if you want an Agatha Prime figure, you actually can get one, which is, kind of ironic. Kenner creating this figure, Dark Horse putting it in a comic book, and then Kenner releasing a figure based on the comic. So, as I mentioned, Agatha Prime was going to harness the power of cloning, which at this point was only mentioned in that one line from Obi-Wan about the Clone Wars. And he was going to create these clone troopers, obviously a little different from what we know as clone troopers. Along with that, there were going to be some new droids. So this was going to be one of the good guy droids that would have been an all-new design and an all-new tool. But some older tools and some older molds that they had would just get repainted. So R5-D4 would have gotten a black deco to become an Imperial droid. And a few of the other droids would have gotten sort of new attack features and sort of multiple limbs where it's almost like they glued 2 robots together. You can see some IG-88 parts, definitely some forlome parts with kind of, would you call that a new head or just a new turret attached? And to have kind of more aggressive features. This protocol droid, or I don't know if it's a protocol droid, but he's got a lot of missiles. Definitely reminds me of the Power of the Force 2 R5-D4 that actually got released, and I wonder if it took influence from this, because he had quite a few attack features too that were not so prominent in the movie or existent, where he had both rockets, or I guess laser cannons that popped up on either side of his legs, and if you split him open down the middle, there was a little button, you can see that yellow button sticking out, that would launch a missile that would fly out of him. So having artillery droids was not completely new. Vehicles would have continued to roll out as well. A few of the ones that made it out in the tail end of the line were released. So things like the A-Wing fighter, which made it out in Power of the Force, and the Tatooine skiff, which did manage, again, to make it out at the very tail end of Power of the Force, probably because they made it far enough along in prototype and pre-production to be worth the price of at least, going into full production and shipping them. The Landspeeder was also going to get reviewed and, I guess, get a turbo retrofit. Luke mentions the XP-38 in the movie. Well, this was the XP-36, which was an upgrade to Luke's Landspeeder, but they weren't going to stop at just the XP-36. We were finally going to see the XP-38 that Luke hints at as putting his Landspeeder as obsolete, and that was going to be Luke's new cool ride that he would drive around in. Han was also going to get his own cool ride, but this wasn't just a Landspeeder. This was a secret cargo vessel / escape pod that you could have plugged into the Millennium Falcon, which is interesting because this idea did get used, even all the way up to the Solo movie and some of the Millennium Falcon toys. The Snowspeeder would have gotten a re-release, this time given a shiny new deco, or rather a bland new deco, in terms of orange, and would have been redubbed the Sand Speeder. as opposed to the snowspeeder. I guess General Madine was going to drive around in this because, that's what he does in his off time. The Rebels would have also gotten a new tank tread-based vehicle because we all know tank treads in Star Wars. Well, I guess they do have some tank treads now, but most Star Wars vehicles hover. One that doesn't hover, of course, was the AT-AT. That would have gotten a refresh and would have been called the AT-IC, or All-Terrain Imperial Cannon, where basically the back end was cut off and a giant cannon was placed inside, and would have been a fun new way to buy a giant walking Star Wars dog, as my parents called it. Kind of similar to the way the Walker got refreshed for Rogue One and became a cargo transport, but instead of cargo, it was going to be more aggressive and just get a frickin' big laser on the back. And then one of my favorites, the Skyhopper, was going to get done. Oh, would have been so excited to have this as a kid. Skyhoppers were Luke's ship on Tatooine, his kind of American Graffiti racing car. And it was in the movie. You can see it right there in the back of Luke's garage. He has a Skyhopper parked outside where it's recently been bashed up a little bit. He even plays with a model of one flying into the air. This is what it would look like if we had actually seen it in the movie. It did get put into the special edition. But this was the craft that he and Biggs would race around and try to thread the stone needle on Tatooine when he was a kid, and how he learned all of his piloting skills. Kenner/Hasbro did eventually release one in Power of the Force 2, and I eagerly bought one and still have it on display in my office. I was really excited to finally get a 3 3/4 scaled Skyhopper for my Luke figure. And flash forward to today, many companies have now done Skyhoppers. It's no longer sort of a holy grail of collectors because you can get a Skyhopper in pretty much any scale and any play pattern you want, from Lego to minis. But Kenner did toy, no pun intended, with the idea of releasing one in the vintage line. We have some more artwork of the Rebel tank that was thought about, this time with different types of wheels instead of just tank treads. And then the big one, the Rebel blockade runner, complete with giant escape pod hanging out the back there. This would have been one of the big hero vehicles that could have been released in '85. It was seen in Return of the Jedi, as well as the very first ship we ever see in A New Hope. So, cool. And you know those guitars that are like double guitars? Well, that concept was going to get applied to the Star Destroyer, and Agatha Prime, when he came along with his clone army, was going to have a double Star Destroyer, because what's worse than one Star Destroyer? 2 Star Destroyers stacked on top of each other. I don't know how they would have pulled this off as a toy. How huge would it have been? Or would they have just shrunk it down? But yeah, that's what he drove around in. And for personal pleasure, when he didn't need his capital ship, Agatha Prime was going to get a little skiff that he could sit in the front and do sort of a, figure-to-figure battle, kind of like Darth Vader in his TIE Advance versus Luke in his X-Wing. So if Agatha Prime wants to, fly around by himself without his clone troops or his double-decker, double-guitar Star Destroyer, he can strap into his little personal ship and have some cool dogfighting with New Alliance pilots, because that's what bad guys do in Star Wars. The granddaddy of them all would have been an Imperial base, complete with a hookup for an AT-AT or an AT-IC, all sorts of cannons and elevators and landing platforms, and a great way to continue playing. And these were kind of the dark times then, when no Star Wars toys were released, because this pitch was not picked up and Star Wars kind of faded from the toy aisle. There were some toys put out during these dark times until the relaunch, including, of course, the Bendham's toys. And I'm going to do a whole video spotlighting the toys that came out during these dark times. That'll be the next one. But this was a look at what Kenner would have done in 1985 had Lucasfilm approved their concept. It was definitely very cool and a cool part of Star Wars history. And for those of you who like Moco Beefheads, hey, thank you so much for watching. If you do like this video, subscribe and like it, because it will tell YouTube to share it with more people, because that whole algorithm thing. And if you have comments, just leave them below and I'll answer them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.